Have you ever had someone tell you, I love you, and yet somehow you still felt completely alone? Not because they were cruel, not because they didn't care, but because something inside you quietly whispered, you still don't know me. Hello, and welcome back to From the Therapy Room Psychology of Mind and Body, understanding how we think, feel, pattern, and become. I'm your host, Jyoti, a clinical counseling psychotherapist. I'm really glad you're here. You're welcome to follow this space and stay connected. This is a space where we explore the inner landscape of human mind, where psychology meets lived experience, and where the stories we carry inside finally find language. In this podcast, we explore the psychology behind everyday emotional experience, the things we often struggle to understand within ourselves. I don't think emotional loneliness begins when we are alone. I think emotional loneliness begins the moment we realize that someone is looking at us without actually seeing us. There is a strange kind of grief that doesn't have a funeral, no flowers, no condolences, no rituals. It is the grief of living your life surrounded by people, yet feeling profoundly unseen. Perhaps you have experienced this. Maybe you have sat across from your partner while having dinner. Words were exchanged, plans were made, bills were discussed, children were talked about, vacations were planned. Everything looked perfectly normal, but inside there was an ache that nobody could see. You wanted to say, can somebody please notice that I'm not okay? But instead, you smiled, you nodded, you carried on, because somewhere along the journey you learned that functioning is easier than explaining. Or maybe you have experienced it in friendships. You're the one everyone calls, everyone trusts, everyone leans on. You know everyone's stories, everyone's heartbreaks, everyone's fears. But when you finally gather the courage to speak about your pain, the conversation somehow returned to them again, and you quietly tell yourself, it's okay, I'll manage. I don't want to be a burden. Or maybe the deepest loneliness wasn't in adulthood at all. Maybe it began much earlier, when you were 5 or 7 or 10, when something happened and nobody noticed what it did to your heart. I wonder if you have ever asked yourself this question, not am I loved, but am I understood? Because those are not the same thing. We often confuse them. Someone can love you deeply and still completely misunderstand who you are. Parents do this, partners do this, friends do this sometimes, and perhaps we do it to ourselves. Understanding is a very different experience. Love says, I care about you. Understanding says, I can see the world from where you are standing. Love can exist without curiosity. Understanding cannot. Love can sometimes become possession. Understanding never does. Love sometimes wants you to stay the same. Understanding makes room for you to become someone new. When people describe their happiest relationship, they rarely begin by saying, they bought me a gift, or they constantly told me they loved me. Instead, they often say things like, they got me. They knew what I meant without me explaining. I felt safe around them. They understood me. Notice the language, not love, recognition. Being recognized by another human being, there is something almost sacred about being emotionally recognized, as if just for one moment your inner world finally became visible. Psychology often speaks about loneliness as being physically alone, but emotional loneliness is something entirely different. You can be surrounded by family and still feel abandoned. You can sleep beside someone every night and still feel emotionally homeless. You can receive hundreds of birthday wishes and still wonder whether anyone actually knows who you are. Because emotional loneliness isn't the absence of people, it is the absence of resonance. It's when your inner experience has nowhere to land. Imagine speaking in a language nobody around you understands. Eventually, you stop speaking. Not because you have nothing to say, but because translating everything becomes exhausting. Many adults are emotionally exhausted, not because life is difficult, but because they have spent decades translating themselves, explaining themselves, justifying themselves, editing themselves, making themselves easier to digest, softer, quieter, less emotional, less complicated, less needy, less intense until one day they look in the mirror and quietly wonder, who am I actually being? I often wonder what happens inside a child who repeatedly has to explain why they are crying, why they are scared, why they are sensitive, why they are quiet, why they are different. Children are extraordinary observers. Long before they understand language, they understand emotional climate. They notice sigh, they notice facial expression, they notice silence, they notice disappointment, they notice tension between adults, they notice when their joy feels inconvenient, and slowly, without anyone teaching them, they begin asking invisible questions. What version of me is easier to love? That question changes everything because the moment a child begins changing themselves to maintain connection, they slowly stop becoming known. They become adapted, not authentic. This is where I want us to slow down because I don't think most people are pretending. I think most people have simply forgotten where pretending began. It wasn't manipulation, it wasn't deception, it was survival. A child cannot afford authenticity if authenticity threatens attachment. So they become what the environment reward: the quiet child, the achiever, the funny one, the responsible one, the invisible one, the peacemaker, the caretaker, the perfect daughter, the strong son, the one who never complains, the one who always smiles, and everyone applauds them. Nobody realizes they are applauding an adaptation, not the child. Maybe that's why, as adult, being loved sometimes doesn't feel like enough because somewhere inside us there is still a child wondering if they really know who I am underneath all of this. Would they still stay? I wonder what if most of our adult relationships are not really conversation between two adults. What if hidden beneath every marriage, every friendship, every workplace, every conflict, every silence, there are two there are actually two children still hoping someone will finally understand what no one understood years ago. That might sound surprising, but stay with me for a moment because I don't think adulthood erases childhood. I think adulthood reveals it, not in obvious ways, not in memories, but in patterns. Have you ever noticed how someone's delayed reply can suddenly feel much bigger than it should? Logically, you know they're probably busy, they're working, driving, sleeping, living their own life, and yet something inside you begin whispering, maybe they're upset with me. Did I say something wrong? Maybe I have become too much. Perhaps they are pulling away. Or so many things. Now imagine another person. They receive the exact same delayed reply. They shrug. They'll respond when they can. Same situation. Entirely different emotional experience. Why? Because we don't react to reality alone. We react to the meaning our nervous system gives reality. And that meaning was often written long before this relationship ever began. One of the greatest misunderstanding about adulthood is believing that maturity means leaving childhood behind. Psychodynamically, that isn't what happens. We don't outgrow our earliest relationships, we organize ourselves around them. Our first relationships become the emotional blueprint through which we begin interpreting every relationship that follows. Not because we are choosing to, but because the mind is remarkably efficient once it learns. This is how connection works. It keeps applying the same template until something helps us rewrite it. Perhaps your childhood taught you love disappears when people are angry. So now every disagreement feels dangerous. Or maybe you learned my feelings make life harder for everyone. So now even when you're hurting, you apologize for crying. Maybe your home was unpredictable. Some days warm, some days cold, some days affectionate, some days emotionally unavailable. As a child, you couldn't understand inconsistency, so instead you blamed yourself. Children almost always do, not because they are irrational, but because believing something is wrong with me actually feels safer than believing the people keeping me alive aren't emotionally safe. Because if the problem is me, then maybe I can fix it. Maybe if I am quieter, better, more successful, less emotional, more grateful, the list I close. That belief follows us into adulthood far more often than we realize. Love isn't always the wound, sometimes confusion is. That's how I would like to put it. I mean, here's something I found profoundly moving. Many people who experienced emotional neglect don't don't remember dramatic abuse. They often say things like, my parents loved me and I believe them. Love may absolutely have been present, but love and emotional attunement are not identical. A parent can feed a child, protect a child, sacrifice for a child, work endlessly for a child, and still never truly enter that child's emotional world. Imagine a little girl who comes home crying because she wasn't chosen by her classmate. She isn't asking for solutions. She isn't asking for advice. She's asking one silent question: can my feeling exist safely inside your presence? But instead, she hears, ignore them. Be strong. You're overreacting. You'll be fine. Stop crying. Now, those sentences don't merely end a conversation, they teach the child something about emotion itself. My sadness makes people uncomfortable, or I should recover quickly, I shouldn't need anyone. And over years, these become unconscious truth, not because anyone intended harm, but because repeated emotional experience becomes psychological reality. Here's something Carl Jung wrote that has stayed with me. I think still it's there, that he suggested that until we make the unconscious conscious, it quietly directs our life, and we call it fate. I often think about that. Perhaps I think whenever I'm talking to any client of mine, I do that, or to, for that matter, to anybody else also. And I often think that because so many people come into therapy believing they are struggling with today's relationship, when very gently we begin discovering they're also carrying yesterday's relationship. Not literally, psychologically. The little boy who had to earn attention becomes the man who constantly overachieves. The little girl who only received affection when she behaved perfectly becomes the woman who feels guilty every time she rests. The child who never felt emotionally chosen may become the adult who anxiously searches every conversation for sign of rejection. From the outside, it looks like personality. Inside, it's often adaptation. Can I ask you something? Not for you to answer out loud, just notice what happens inside. Imagine someone knew every thought you have never admitted, every insecurity, every fear, jealousy, every shame, every longing, every contradiction, every part of yourself you work so hard to hide. Now ask yourself, what do you imagine would happen next? Would they move closer or would they leave? For many people, the answer appears almost instantly, not because it's objectively true, but because somewhere they have already rehearsed that ending, sometimes for decade. Jung gave us a beautiful word for this, the persona. Not a mask meant to deceive others, a mask designed to survive among them. The version of ourselves we believe the world can tolerate, the competent one, the endlessly positive one, the helper, the achiever, the funny one, the independent one, the spiritual one, the therapist who always seems to have it together, the person or the parent who never struggles, the husband who never cries, the wife who never asks for too much, the child who never creates problem. The persona isn't fake, it's incomplete. It carries many of our thoughts, but it also quietly protects the part of us that once learned these pieces of me aren't welcome. And over time, something heartbreaking can happen. People begin loving the persona, praising the persona, depending on the persona, while the authentic self quietly wonders, would anyone love me if I stopped performing? There's a question which is coming into my mind while I'm sharing all this with you guys. Perhaps the deepest exhaustion you feel today isn't coming from responsibilities. Maybe it's coming from maintaining an identity that was built for survival instead of one built for aliveness. And perhaps ache to be understood. It is really the longing to finally put that identity down, not because it's wrong, but because you have been carrying it for so long, you have forgotten how heavy it is. When someone truly understands you, something extraordinary happens. You don't feel admired, you don't even necessarily feel loved, you feel safe enough to stop performing. And perhaps that is one of the rarest experience a human being can ever have. I would like you to imagine something. Imagine a newborn baby, not the kind of baby we see in photograph, not the smiling baby, just a human nervous system entering the world for the very first time. They don't know language, they don't know success, they don't know failure, they don't know whether they are intelligent or attractive or capable. They know only one thing, connection. At the beginning of life, connection isn't simply comforting, it is survival. A baby's brain cannot regulate overwhelming emotions by itself when fear arrives. The baby cannot tell themselves this feeling will pass. When sadness arrives, they cannot meditate overwhelmed. They cannot go for a walk or journal or distract themselves. Their nervous system depend upon another nervous system, the calm face, the gentle voice, the predictable embrace, the eyes that say, I know you're frightened and I'm here. Before we borrow language from our parents, we borrow regulation. Borrow Before we borrow beliefs, we borrow emotional safety. And perhaps this is one of the deepest truths in psychology. The first home we ever live in is not our house, it is another person's nervous system. Just let this that settle for a moment, because if your first emotional home felt unpredictable, confusing, dismissive, or emotionally absent, your body may have learned that love is uncertain, long before your mind ever understood the word love. There is a beautiful idea in developmental psychology that has always moved me. It isn't that children need perfect parents. In fact, perfection can become another burden. Children don't need perfection, they need someone who is emotionally available often enough. Someone who notices, someone who wonders, someone who is curious, someone who doesn't immediately rush to fix them. Imagine a little boy who proudly runs to show his father a drawing. The father glances for 2 seconds. Without looking carefully, he says, "Very nice," then returns to his phone. Now imagine another father. He kneels down, looks carefully, smiles, and says, "Tell me about this part. I can see you spent a lot of time on it." Do you notice the difference? The drawing wasn't what the child wanted to share. The child wanted someone to enter his inner world. Children aren't asking, "Do you approve of what I made?" They are asking, "Will you come into my experience with me?" That question never really disappears. We simply begin asking it differently in marriage, in friendship, in therapy, in love. We don't always need agreement, we need witnessing. There is something that I think many relationships quietly miss when someone says, "I have had difficult days," or "I have had difficult day." Our minds often rush towards solution, advice, logic, perspective, but often that isn't what the soul is asking for. Sometimes another human being simply wants their experience to exist without correction, without comparison, without interruption, without someone saying, "At least you should." Don't think like that. Being understood isn't someone solving your problem, it's someone sitting beside your pain long enough that is no longer feels like you have to carry it alone. And perhaps that is why understanding heals in ways advice often cannot. There was a British psychoanalyst named Donald Winnicott who offered one of the most beautiful ideas I have ever encountered. He spoke about something called the true self and the false self. The false self isn't dishonesty, it's adaptation. Imagine a child whose emotional reality repeatedly isn't welcomed. Every time they become angry, they are punished. Every time they cry, they are dismissed. Every time they express excitement, they are told they are too loud. Every time they ask for comfort, they are told they are too needy. Eventually, something extraordinary and heartbreaking happens. The child doesn't stop having those feelings, they stop showing them. Not because the feeling disappear, but because expression feels dangerous. So another version of the self quietly develops, often that fits, one that pleases, one that performs, one that smiles, one that says, "I'm fine," even when the heart quietly whispers, "I'm falling apart." And after years, that performance becomes so familiar, they no longer recognize it as performance. They call it their personality. One of the saddest moments I witness in therapy doesn't usually involve tears. It often sounds like, "I don't know what I want. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I actually feel." People often assume this means something is wrong with them. I don't think so. I think it means they have spent so many years becoming who everyone else needed that nobody ever asked, "Who are you before all of that?" Imagine 30 years learning how to read everyone else's emotional weather, but never your own. Imagine becoming fluent in everyone else's need while becoming a stranger to your own. That isn't selfishness, it's often survival. Let's start talk about something that our culture often celebrate, being the one who never needs anyone, the strong one, the capable one, the independent one. They are dependable, reliable, always available, always composed. But sometimes hyper dependence isn't confidence. Sometimes it's grief wearing the cloth of competence. Is the child who learned nobody is coming if I need someone, I'll be disappointed. Depending on people hurts, or I'll survive by depending only on myself. The world applaud that person, but very few ask, who taught you that needing another human being wasn't safe? And sometimes the most independent people aren't the least needy. They are simply the people who stop believing their needs would ever be met. Have you ever given it a thought that why being understood feels like home? I wonder if you have ever experienced it. This You are speaking with someone, and for the first time, you don't have to explain every sentence. They don't interrupt, they don't immediately advise, they don't minimize, they don't rush, they don't try to rescue you. Simply stay curious, present, gentle. Something begin happening inside your body. Your shoulders soften, your breathing slows, the tightness in your chest ease, your voice changes. You hear yourself saying things you have never said aloud before, not because you have suddenly become more honest, but because your nervous system has quietly concluded. It's safe here. Perhaps this is why people often leave a deeply attuned conversation saying, I don't know what happened, but I feel lighter. Nothing was fixed, nothing was solved, but something profoundly human occurred. For a brief moment, your inner world was carried by another consciousness. You were no longer translating yourself, you were simply known. So maybe the question isn't why do I feel lonely? Maybe the deeper question is how much of my life have I spent believing I had to earn the right to be understood. And if that question is still something within you, don't rush to answer it. Just let it accompany you for a while. Because some questions are not meant to be solved immediately, they are meant to slowly eliminate the room inside us that have remained closed for years. Perhaps the greatest act of healing is not becoming something new. Perhaps it's finally meeting the self who has been patiently waiting beneath all the adaptation, hoping that one day someone, including you, would become curious enough to truly understand them. Can I ask you something? Have you ever looked back at your relationships and wondered, why do I keep ending up with the same kind of person? Perhaps their face changes, their profession changes, their age changes, their personality even changes, but somehow the emotional experience felt strangely familiar. You tell yourself this time it's different, and for a while, it genuinely feels different until one day you find yourself carrying the same loneliness, the same confusion, the same silent question. Why do I feel unseen again? If you have ever asked yourself that, I want you to know something. I don't think you are I don't think so that you're choosing pain. I think you're choosing familiarity. And those two are different things, are not always the same. One of the greatest paradox of being human is that the nervous system doesn't automatically choose what is healthy. It chooses what is familiar. Even when familiar hurts, imagine growing up in a home where affection was unpredictable. Some days your parents was emotionally available, other days they were withdrawn, distracted, preoccupied. Perhaps struggling with burden you were too young to understand. As a child, you couldn't walk away. So your nervous system learned something extraordinary. Stay alert. Watch carefully. Notice every change in mood. Try harder. Maybe this time you'll get through. Years later, you meet someone. They are warm. then distant, then distant, close, then unavailable, attentive, then impossible to reach, and something inside you feels drawn toward them, not because inconsistency feels good, but because your nervous system whispers, I have lived here before. There is something I wish more people understood. Chemistry isn't always compatibility. We often describe attraction as chemistry, but psychology asks a deeper question. What actually are we calling chemistry? Sometimes what feel what feels like an instant connection is actually instant recognition, not recognition of the person, recognition of an emotional pattern. The body quietly says, I know this dance, I know how to pursue, I know how to wait, I know how to earn affection. I know how to overthink. I know how to become indispensable. I know how to disappear. And because it feels familiar, we mistake it for destiny. Perhaps that is why some relationships feel electric from the beginning, not because they are healthy, but because they awaken something ancient inside us. I wonder if sometimes we also fall in love with possibilities, with imagined future, with unfinished stories, with hopes. You met someone emotionally unavailable instead of seeing who they are. Your heart quietly began writing a different ending. Maybe they'll open up with me. Maybe they'll finally choose me. Maybe if I am patient enough. Maybe if I love them deeply enough. Notice something? Your energy slowly shifts. You're no longer relating to the actual person. You're relating to the potential version of them. And perhaps that isn't really about them. Perhaps it's about someone else. Someone from much earlier in your life. The parent who never fully arrived emotionally. The caregiver whose love always felt just out of reach. Without realizing it, your psyche whisper, maybe this time I'll finally succeed. Children are remarkably hopeful, even in painful homes. Perhaps especially in painful homes. A child rarely stops loving a parent. Instead, they keep adjusting themselves. Maybe if I'm quieter, maybe if I achieve more, maybe I don't. If I don't ask anything more, maybe if I become easier to love. Hope keeps the child emotionally alive, but sometimes the same hope quietly follow them into adulthood. Now they stay in relationship far beyond what nourishes them, not because they lack intelligence, not because they are weak, but because somewhere inside the child still believes, if I love enough, maybe this person will finally see me. That isn't foolish. It's heartbreaking because it reveals just how deeply every child longs to be met. Carl Jung believed that every human being carries part of themselves they had to hide, not because those parts were bad, but because those parts weren't welcomed. Parts your anger wasn't welcomed, perhaps your sadness wasn't welcome, perhaps your confidence wasn't welcome, perhaps your sensitivity, your ambition, your vulnerability wasn't welcomed. Those parts don't disappear, they move into what Jung called the shadow. Now, the word shadow often sounds frightening, but I don't think it is. The shadow isn't the darkest part of us, it is often the most abandoned part of us. The pieces of ourselves we learn to exile in order to belong. Sometimes we spend years searching for those exiled qualities in other people. We admire people who are confident because our own confidence had to hide. We admire emotionally expressive people because we learned emotional restraint. We admire freedom because we learned duty. We admire softness because we become strength. Sometimes the people who fascinate us are carrying pieces of ourselves we have forgotten. There's another idea from Jung that feels deeply relevant here, projection. We usually think projection means placing negative qualities into others, but it can also mean placing our unlived life onto them. Have you ever met someone and immediately believed they are everything I have been looking for? And within days or weeks, they become extraordinary in your mind, also magical. You don't really know them yet, but your imagination fills in the spaces. This isn't stupidity, it's humanity. Sometimes we don't fall in love with who someone is, we fall in love with the story our unconscious begins writing about them. Only later, when reality slowly appears, do we feel disappointed not because they changed, but because they were never carrying the stories we placed upon them. Here is something that surprises many people: emotionally healthy love is often less dramatic, less intoxicating, less confusing. It doesn't keep you guessing, it doesn't constantly activate your nervous system, it doesn't require endless decoding. Sometimes people say they are wonderful, but I don't feel that spark. I gently wonder, is it possible that what feels unfamiliar is actually emotional safety? If your nervous system has learned that love always comes with uncertainty, then certainty can initially feel strangely boring. Not because it lacks depth, but because your body hasn't learned the peace is also a form of intimacy. I think many of us have spent years longing to be chosen as a partner, as a friend, as an employee, as favorite. Chosen as enough, but perhaps being chosen is not the deepest human longing. Perhaps the deeper longing is to be seen, to have someone look at you, not for what you produce, not for what you provide, not for how useful you are, but for the person quietly living beneath all those roles. To hear someone say, I can see the part of you that you have spent years hiding, and you don't have to hide them with me. I don't know if there is a sentence more healing than that. Before we continue, I wonder how many of your relationships have actually been conversation between your present self and your younger self. Still hoping someone would finally understand what was never understood. And if that's true, perhaps the goal isn't to fight someone who rescued the child within you. Perhaps it's to become so deeply acquainted with that child that when someone truly sees you, you can actually believe them. Because one of the quietest tragedies in human relationship is not that we fail to find love, is that sometimes love finally arrives, but we cannot receive it. Not because we don't want it, but because every earlier experience taught us that being fully known was too dangerous. So when someone genuinely tries to understand us, we doubt them, question them, pull away, or continue performing, not because we are broken, but because our nervous system is still protecting a younger version of ourselves. And healing often begins not when someone else understands us, but when we slowly stop abandoning the part of ourselves that have waited a lifetime to be understood. Can I tell you something that I have quietly noticed? Some of the loneliest people I have ever met are not the perhaps who are alone. They are the people everyone believes is doing perfectly fine. The one who always smiles, the one who remembers everyone's birthday, the one who checks on everyone else, the one who says, I'm okay, almost automatically, not because they are lying, but because somewhere along the way they forget there was another answer. I sometimes wonder how many of us are loved not for who we are, but for the role we learn to play. The responsible one, the strong one, the caregiver, and all those things. So the one who never asks so much, the one who always understands everyone else. And I think here's the painful part. The longer we perform that role, the harder it's become for someone, for anyone to meet the real person underneath it. Because nobody knows they are missing someone, even we don't. There is a sentence I hear often in therapy: I don't want to be a burden. Whenever someone says that, I rarely hear adulthood speaking. I hear a younger voice, a child who once noticed that their sadness made the room uncomfortable, a child who learned to swallow tears because everyone else already had enough to carry, a child who slowly concluded, if I need less, people stay closer. And so they grew up becoming wonderfully self sufficient. But underneath that independence, there is often a quiet longing. Will someone notice that I'm struggling without me having to ask? Think about how exhausting that to spend a year becoming fluent in everyone else's emotion while remaining illiterate in your own. To know exactly what your partner needs, exactly what your children needs, exactly what your friend needs. But when someone asks, and what do you need? You genuinely don't know. Not because you don't have needs, but because you have spent decades placing them last. I think this is why being understood feel almost overwhelming. Sometimes people cry not because someone solved their problem, but because someone finally asked a question no one had asked before. How has all of this been for you? Not what happened, not what did you do, but what has it been like to live inside your experience? Do you notice the difference? One asks for information, the other asks for your inner world. And perhaps our souls have always been waiting for someone to ask the second question. There is another paradox here. The more we fear rejection, the more we hide ourselves. The more we hide ourselves, the more people know only our performance. They, we quietly whisper, nobody really knows me. But how could they? They have only met the version of us that believed it had to earn love, not the one who simply wanted to receive it. So maybe healing begins with a different question. Instead of asking who understand me, people perhaps ask, where have I stopped allowing myself to be understood? Where do I change my opinion so no one disagree? Where do I laugh when I'm actually hurt? Where do I say it's okay when it really isn't? Where do I keep translating myself instead of trusting that the right people will stay curious enough to learn my language? I don't think authenticity means telling everyone everything. Boundaries are healthy. Privacy is healthy. Discernment is healthy. But there is a difference between protecting yourself and disappearing. Many of us learn to disappear so gradually that we mistook it for maturity. Perhaps, can I tell you something that I don't think we speak about enough? Sometimes we say we want someone to understand us, but when actually someone actually begins to, we become frightened. Have you ever noticed that someone asks, are you really okay? And instead of answering honestly, you smile. I'm just tired. It's nothing. I'll be fine. Why? If understanding is what we long for, why do we hide the very part we hope someone will see? I don't think so. It's because we are dishonest. I think it's because we have learned something very early in life, that visibility can be dangerous. Perhaps when you express sadness, you were told you were too sensitive. Perhaps when you become angry, you were punished. Perhaps when you were excited, you were told to calm down. Perhaps when you asked for comfort, someone responded with irritation instead of warmth. So your nervous system quietly reached a conclusion. Some part of me are safer when they stay hidden. And without realizing it, you carried that belief into adulthood. Then one day, when someone genuinely asks, tell me what's really going on, your hearts want to answer, but your body hesitates. Because your body remembers something your conscious mind has forgotten. It remembers every moment when honesty cost you connection. It remembers every time vulnerability was met with silence, criticism, or indifference. So even though your adult mind says the person is safe, this person is safe, your nervous system whispers, be careful. This is why healing can feel so confusing. Sometimes the greatest obstacle isn't finding emotionally safe people, is teaching our own nervous system that safety now exists. There's another quiet fear, and I wonder if you have ever felt it. What if they really know me and decide I'm too much, too emotional, too quiet, too complicated, too ambitious, too needy, too sensitive, too broken, too ordinary? We all have different words, but beneath them is often the same question. If I stop performing, will I still be loved? That question doesn't belong only to adulthood. It echoes from much earlier, from the child who learned that acceptance sometimes dependent upon adaptation. Perhaps this is why understanding feels so sacred, because genuine understanding doesn't ask you to become smaller, it doesn't ask you to edit yourself, it doesn't ask you to earn your place. It simply says you don't have to convince me that your experience is real. And for many people, those words become the beginning of healing. So maybe the next time someone asks, how are you? You don't have to tell them your entire life story, but perhaps you could become just a little more honest than yesterday. Not because vulnerability is owed to everyone, it isn't, but because healing often begins one truthful sentence at a time, one conversation at a time, one safe relationship at a time, until gradually you discover that the part of yourself you spent years protecting were never asking to be hidden. They were simply waiting for somewhere safe enough to belong. And perhaps that safe place is not something we find overnight. Perhaps it's something we slowly build within our relationship, within our communities, within therapy, and eventually within ourselves. Before we finish today, I would like to ask one last question, not for you to answer immediately. Just carry it with you. When was the last time you truly felt understood, not admired, not complicated, not appreciated, just not needed, understood? The kind of understanding where you didn't have to explain why something hurts, you didn't have to defend your emotion, you didn't have to minimize your pain so someone else would feel comfortable. You simply existed, and someone stayed with you. Perhaps that's one of the deepest human longing, not to become extraordinary, but to become visible. Because there is quite difference between being noticed and being known. Many people notice what you do. You knows what it costs you to keep doing it. They notice your smile, they don't see the tears you held back in the car before walking into work. They notice your success, they don't see the anxiety that kept you awake the night before. They notice that you're always there for everyone else. They notice they don't notice that sometimes you wish someone would ask I how are really doing, and then wait long enough to hear that honest answer. I think so much of adulthood becomes an invisible performance. We perform competence, we perform so many things, and sometimes we become so good at performing that even we forget where the performance end and where we begin. Maybe that's why moments of genuine understanding feels almost overwhelming, because for a brief moment we no longer have to carry the costume. We can simply be human. If there is one thing I hope you take away from today's conversation, it's this: your deepest wound may not have been that you weren't loved enough. It may have been that large parts of your inner world were never truly witnessed. Your fear, your confusion, your sensitivity, your anger, your dreams, your tenderness, your grief, not because people didn't care, sometimes they care deeply, but then they may never have learned how to enter another person's emotional world. Most of us can only offer what we ourselves have experienced. Someone who was never emotionally understood as a child may spend their entire life loving others without ever knowing how to understand them. Not because they lack love, but because no one ever taught them the language. And I think that realization changes something, because it allows compassion to enter where blame once lived. It doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it helps us understand it. There is a quote by Carl Jung that I have always found deeply meaningful. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And I have often wondered what you call it a privilege. Perhaps becoming yourself is much harder than becoming who the world needed you to be. The world often rewards the role, but your soul quietly longs for the person. Becoming someone different, is having the courage to stop abandoning yourself again and again and again. And maybe that's where understanding begin, not with another person, but with the relationship with yourself. Can you become curious about your own reaction instead of judging them? Ask, what happened to me that made this feel so frightening instead of what's wrong with me? Can you meet your anxiety with curiosity instead of criticism? Can you meet your sadness with compassion instead of? Can you sit beside your younger self instead of asking them to grow up before they were ever comforted? Because perhaps the child inside you has never been asking for perfection. They have simply been waiting for someone to finally understand, and maybe that someone can slowly become you. If today's conversation has stirred something inside you, I don't want you to feel pressured to figure out everything night tonight. Insight is beautiful. But healing is rarely a single moment, it is a relationship. The relationship with your story, with your body, with your emotion, with your memories, your pattern, and slowly with yourself. This has been from the therapy room, Psychology of Mind and Body. If this resonated with you, you can share what you felt or noticed. I would love to hear your reflections. And if you find this conversation meaningful, if this conversation felt like it was speaking directly to your inner world, if something is in today's conversation is resonated, as I said, I would love to reflection, but don't rush to move on. Sit with this, journal about it, talk to someone you trust, notice what emotions surfaced while you were listening. Please share this episode with someone who might quietly need it, because so many people live inside this pattern silently. And if you enjoy psychologically deep therapy room style conversation around healing, relationship trauma, anxiety, attachment, and emotional well being, follow the podcast on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Podcast. Thank you for spending time with me. Thank you for being there. Thank you for listening. And until next time, be gentle with yourself. See you next time. I'll be sitting next beside to you. Take care.